Okay, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Hobbit Immersion Camp, Day 3, as we talk about what is many people's favorite chapter of The Hobbit. I know it has always been my favorite chapter of The Hobbit, Riddles in the Dark, with Gollum. So I will not take any more of your time. Looking forward to your questions again. If you happen to be joining us live for the first time today, questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel is what you enter in order to submit your questions so that Ms. Binkley can be answering your questions live during class. Thanks very much, everybody.
Good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. Welcome. And I'm going to start not referring to you guys as campers, but as Tolkien scholars. Your questions yesterday were incredible. These are the questions that people who study Tolkien are always asking of one another, and they're always researching it and trying to find out more information. So the questions you're asking are really on mark and awesome. So today we're going to start with chapter 5, but as always, what we're going to do is we are going to take a look at the map and see where Bilbo is. Just to refresh our memories, he left Hobbiton, had his troll adventure, left Rivendell, was on his way over the mountain because remember they're headed for the East Road, but got captured by the goblins, and right at the end of the last chapter, the goblins were chasing them, and Dory the dwarf who's carrying Bilbo, because Bilbo's got little tiny legs and they're just running along, he gets grabbed from behind, he trips, he drops Bilbo, Bilbo knocks his head, Bilbo's unconscious. So we're going to start out right there where we left off. Oops, and there it goes again. Okay. Yeah. There we go. So Bilbo gets knocked out and he's crawling along in the dark. He doesn't have a clue where he is. He doesn't know where he's going. And he just keeps following the tunnels. And as he's crawling through the tunnels, he puts his hand down and he finds something that feels like a little ring. He just drops it in his pocket and he keeps crawling. One of the things he discovers while he's crawling around is that, oh, I have this little sword, this knife that he got out of the troll hoard, and he pulls it out of the sheath and it glows. And he says, oh, so this is elven make as well. So this sword is also made in Gondolin, he assumes. So now he has at least some light. So anyway, while he's wandering around, he roams until splash, he steps in some cold water. And he says, oh, there's an underground river or an underground lake here or something. So deep down here by the dark, cold water lived old Gollum, a small and slimy creature. So here is this lake. And then as he's looking around, he sees a Gollum. And he says, okay, who or what are you? Well, Gollum sees him and says, well, who or what is that? And I wonder if it's edible. Is this something I can eat? So he comes over, Gollum does, and talks to Bilbo. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about these pictures here. I want you to take a look at these eyes, that all of these different ones, even this one here, look at those eyes. Look at the eyes here. Look at the eyes here. This one here actually has him with a fish. And here he's got his little boat that he paddles around the lake. And here you can see the little boat in the back. Lots of pictures of Gollum. Take a look at this next one. Here we have more pictures of Gollum. Once again, the big eyes. Now he has the sword out, though. You can see the glowing sword here. Big eyes again. One of the things I want to point out here is this one uses black and white, just pencil to draw it. You don't need to use a lot of colors to get your idea of cross. Mr. Howe has used hatching here. Take a look how he's just gone back and forth to create a dark area around the glowing sword. So that's a fascinating technique to show something that's whenever it's really, really dark, to show how shiny something is. So Gollum takes a look at Bilbo, and he says, "What's he got in his hands?" said Gollum, looking at the sword, which he did not quite like. "A sword, a blade which came out of Gondolin," says Bilbo. And then Gollum becomes quite polite. Let's take a quick moment, another quick moment here to look. Here's those big eyes again. Glowing sword, big eyes. Another glowing sword. I really like the eyes on this one. Gollum here looks like he's pretty hungry. Hungry Gollum. So Gollum replies with a "Sss," he hisses, said Gollum, and he became quite polite. "Perhaps she sits here and chats with it a bitsy, my precious. It likes riddles, perhaps it does it?" He, Gollum, that is, was anxious to appear friendly at any rate for the moment until he found out more about the sword and the hobbit, whether he was quite alone, meaning Bilbo, was he alone, whether he was good to eat, and whether Gollum was really hungry. So the riddles were the only thing that Gollum, could think of. Before we start on the riddles, let's take a look at what kind of questions you guys have for me today. Niall wonders, does anything or anyone live on Lonely Mountain? Well, are you referring to the Lonely Mountain, Erebor? I'm kind of confused there because right now we are in the Misty Mountains. And if you're asking about the Misty Mountains, I know that there are all sorts of animals that live in the Misty Mountains. There are wolves. Of course, the goblins are living under the mountains because they don't really like the light. There are eagles who have their nests up in the hillsides of the mountains. I know there are bears there because Bjorn, one of our characters we'll meet, he talks something about coming from the Misty Mountains. So there are bears in the Misty Mountains. So I imagine there's lots of animals there. As for Erebor right now, let's just wait and see until we get there and see what happens. Okay. Bullroarer somebody has a question about Bullroarer. It says, "I have a question from before. Why weren't the golems afraid of Bilbo? His grandfather killed goblins all the time." No, this is from Will F. Okay, and you think, I see, that was a note to me. Okay, well, yes, Bilbo's did have a relative who fought in a goblin war. And he fought and knocked the head off a goblin and was famous for that. They make a bit of information about that in the movie, but in The Hobbit itself, we don't hear anything about it. And you have to also remember that the dwarves and the goblins had a very fierce war as well. But they're not afraid of the dwarves. As a matter of fact, they're angry at the dwarves. The elves and the goblins had wars. That's what these swords were made for, were the wars. But they're not going to be afraid of the elves either. They're going to battle with them. So they're not going to be afraid of a hobbit. What is Gollum? The clan is wondering. He is like a lost goblin that just went insane. Well, actually, we're going to learn in Chapter 2, The Fellowship of the Ring, the background of Gollum. Right now, all we know is that he's a little slimy creature that lives under the mountain. In the Fellowship of the Ring, we learn that he is a type of hobbit, or he is of a hobbit kind. Gollum has been living at this lake under the mountain for hundreds of years. And so he's kind of changed, I guess, morphed into more of an underground creature, and so he looks a little odd. But he has a lot in common with hobbits. For example, telling riddles. So we'll talk about that during the riddles part. What would Gollum eat? Everything, asked Amy. Well, Amy, you know what? He will eat anything. He eats the fish, he chews on the bones. He's eaten, I thought I saw someplace a mention of him eating leather. I know that he captures goblins and takes those away down to his lake and eats them. He mentions in the book that he did have some young goblin bones left over if Bilbo didn't turn out to be edible. And Jubilee was asking, how long has Gollum been in his cave? Well, once again, we find out that he's been in his cave for about 500 years. Whenever he found the ring in the Gladden Fields with his cousin, and when they were out fishing, and then he took the ring underground. And we'll talk some more about that whenever we read the next book. What is Gollum's backstory, Joshua wants to know. Well, we find out about that in the Fellowship of the Ring. And someone else, CJ, was asking, how old is Gollum? Gollum's around 500 years old. I looked that up today because you guys are really good at nailing me down on the age of things. So you're keeping Ms. Binkley honest. And that's good. That's fun because I like looking these things up. And Amy also has another question about, does the Hobbit occur on Earth or on Earth like the planet? Well, actually, Middle Earth is the planet we live on. So this is a story that took place a long, long, long time ago. So it's kind of like a prehistoric almost story, I guess you could say. So it is our planet. This is where we live. So all of this happens on Earth, but it's a really, really long time ago. Jubilee is asking a very good question. Gollum has not seen light for ages, so she's wondering if he would be blinded by the sword, by his sword glowing blue. Very interesting question, Jubilee. I don't think I've ever had anyone ask me that before. I think that the glow is pretty dim, and I know that Gollum does go up towards where the outside is, whether or not he actually goes outside. But whenever, we'll look at a picture right at the end of this chapter, and you can see how much light it is. And I know Gollum does go up to that area where there is light. And how big is Gollum's cave, CJ wants to know. Well, CJ, I'm going to leave that up to your imagination. I've always imagined it as being a fairly large cave. If you've ever taken a trip into a cave, I know that in the continental United States, there are lots of caves you can actually go into. And, you know, they have the pathways in and with lights on and that kind of thing. Or you could even look at pictures online or in books and get kind of some ideas of how big caves are. Some caves are massive, but I've never thought of Gollum's cave as being particularly huge. Amy, now we're talking about food again. Amy, you're going to make me hungry. Would a hobbit eat a hobbit? I don't think so. I haven't read anything about cannibalism in hobbits. Although if Gollum is a hobbit, he intends to eat Bilbo. So let's take a look at our next slide here and see how he's going to do that. Now take a look here. The G with the slash means Gollum is asking the question, and the answer then would be given by Bilbo. And this one, Bilbo is asking the question. The answer is given by Gollum. Okay? Now Gollum starts because Bilbo can't think of any answers. We're going to just read through these fairly quickly because there are a few things that I want you to notice. Remember yesterday I said you really need to pay attention to the sounds in Tolkien's poetry? This is a good example of the sounds, and so we're going to be talking about some of that stuff. So Gollum says, what has roots as nobody sees is taller than trees. Up, up it goes, and yet never grows. And Bilbo says, easily, it's a mountain. Well, Bilbo's worried about Gollum eating him, so the first riddle that pops into his mind is this one. 30 white horses on a red hill. First they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. And Gollum, of course, knows the answer to that one. And he says teeth, and then he points out that he only has a very few teeth. I think he says 9, maybe it's 6. So anyway, it's a tie so far. They've both been able to answer each other's. Then Gollum says, and this is where I want you to start noticing, these are kind of dark riddles. These aren't real happy riddles. Voiceless, it cries. Wingless, flutters. Toothless, bites. Mouthless, mutters. So not only do we have that kind of blah, 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 blah from flutters and mutters, but everything in here is less. There is no voice. There are no wings. There are no teeth. There is no mouth. So we're starting to see the dark side. But Bilbo gives the answer, wind. And then Bilbo comes up with a riddle, makes one up on the spot. An eye and a blue face saw an eye and a green face. That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye, but in a low place, not in a high place. Well, Gollum's stumped. Gollum has to think for a really, 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 really long time. And then, since he's lived underground so long, he's forgotten a lot of the stuff that he used to know whenever he was above ground. And then he remembers it's the sun shining down on flowers like daisies, because daisies have that big dark eye and all the bright colored flower petals around them. So he answers that one, and the game's still tied. Then Gollum asks, once again, listen to the sounds about this. Cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. There's a lot of cannots in here. So it's not a real positive riddle. It lies behind stars in the under hills, and empty holes it fills. It comes first and follows after. Ends life, kills laughter. It's kind of a heavy riddle to be chanting out there, but it kind of gives us a little bit of information about the kind of person that Gollum is. He kind of has a dark side to him. But Bilbo does give the answer, and he says, dark. So they're still tied. So Bilbo now, Mr. Positive, has another riddle. He says, a box without hinges, key, or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid. And once again, Gollum has to really dig back into his memory about what is he talking about, because he's talking about an egg. The egg has the golden yolk inside of it. Gollum's lived underground so long, again, that he's forgotten a lot of these things, but finally a memory comes up and he remembers what an egg is. He remembers teaching his grandmother how to suck eggs. Now, eggs are a high protein source, and a raw egg sounds a little gross. I don't think I'd like one. But anyway, that's a way that many people do eat their eggs. They just crack them open and then they suck the insides out. So it's still tied. Nobody has won yet. Then Gollum has another one. Once again, a little bit dark. Alive without breath, as cold as death. Never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking. Well, this one starts to stump Bilbo. Now, this was one that I got right away, and I'm not really good with riddles. But I got this one right away, and what gave it away to me was the mail. Like chain mail, just being laid one pattern over another. Fish scales are like that, and so I figured it out. And so I felt kind of sorry for Bilbo that he didn't figure that out. And then in the pond, he sees a fish jump out, and it kind of lands close to him. I think it lands on his foot, and then Bilbo realizes, oh, it's a fish. So they're still tied. Then Bilbo tells another one, and he's hoping this one will stump Gollum. No legs lay on one leg, two legs set near on three legs, four legs got some. And you know what? Gollum got that one right away. It's a fish on a table, a man on a stool is sitting there, and then he gave the bones to the cat. So they're still tied. Bilbo's starting to think that he might end up being somebody's lunch. Then Gollum says, this thing, all thing devours. Now that doesn't sound very friendly, does it, devouring things? Birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stone to meal, slays king, ruins town, and beats high mountain down. Once again, listen to these sounds. This is not a friendly riddle. And Bilbo is stumped. He doesn't know what to say. So he's thinking and he's thinking and he's thinking and he's thinking. And then he meant to say, give me more time, because Gollum is coming closer, and Gollum starts to think, ooh, how am I going to eat this hobbit? And Bilbo is so flustered that the only thing that comes out of his mouth is time, which is the answer, because time is a thing that devours everything, and it grinds hard stones to meal, beats high mountains down. So they're still tied, but now it is Bilbo's turn to ask the riddle. So he's saying, well, I can't think. He's talking to himself, I can't think of one, I can't think of a riddle, I got to do something here, it's my turn, what am I going to do? So Gollum's impatient. He's like, you got to ask us a question, my precious. Yes, yes, yes. Just one more question to guess. Yes, yes, said Gollum. Now notice he said question. He didn't say riddle. He said question. So Bilbo's still kind of thinking, what riddle am I going to say? What riddle am I going to say? And while he's there, he's fumbling around in his pockets, and he feels that ring that he picked up while he was crawling around in the dark tunnels. And he says, what have I got in my pocket? He thought he was talking to himself, but Gollum thought it was a riddle, and Gollum became frightened. Riddle, it's a question. But they agree that they are going to include this as one of the things to answer. And so they change the rules a little bit. Bilbo agrees to give Gollum 3 guesses. And if he can guess what he has in his pocket in 3 guesses, then they'll go on to another round of riddles. But if they don't, if Gollum can't answer it in 3 tries, then that means Gollum has to take him out of the tunnels and show him where the door is. Okay, but if he does figure out what he's got in his pocket, then they go to another round of riddles. So let's take a look here now at these here. I see a lot of riddle questions coming in, so let's see here. Abigail is asking something about the age of hobbits. If Gollum is a hobbit, then how can he be 500 years old? You said that the hobbits live to be around 100. You are absolutely right, Abigail, but you have to remember that we don't know that he's 500 years old, and we don't know that he's a hobbit until we start into Tolkien's next book, The Fellowship of the Ring. Right now, we don't really know what he is except that he is a creature. So I will briefly answer your question, and then whenever you start reading chapter 2 in The Fellowship of the Ring, you can find your answer in there. But what happened was that this little ring, which is it's only a magic ring right now. It doesn't have anything to do with anything else in this story. However, Tolkien turned the magic ring into something that actually prolongs, it stretches out a person's life. It happens to men that it makes their life longer. It doesn't give them more life. It just stretches it out. And if you go ahead and take a read of chapters 1 and 2 in The Fellowship of the Ring, after you finish The Hobbit, you'll find that Tolkien does talk about that in the book. Jubilee wants to know if Gollum is all skeleton. Well, he's usually pictured by most people in their mind movies as a pretty skinny person. That this is a person who has to live pretty much hand to mouth, meaning that every day he has to go out and find food to eat. He doesn't have any way to preserve food, so if he does capture a goblin, he would have to eat it all at once, because otherwise it would start to rot, and then he would get sick if he ate rotten food. So yeah, he's living what we call hand to mouth, meaning hunting and looking for food on a daily basis. CJ wants to know if there were more Gollums. Interesting question, CJ. This is the only one I'm aware of, and it's the only one that I can think of that Tolkien wrote about. Although there may be another one tucked into some of his literature. I have not read all of the background books on his writing of The Lord of the Rings, although I did read his background book on the writing of The Hobbit, and I don't remember any other Gollums being mentioned anywhere. Caden would like to know what kind of water is in the cave. Excellent question, Caden. Would it be salt water or fresh water, he would like to know. This would most likely be fresh water, because it would be seeping in through the rocks or an underground river of some kind. And usually what happens then is that the water in underground facilities is usually fresh water as opposed to saline. Okay, Brendan would like to know about how does Gollum eat with so few teeth? Probably with a great deal of difficulty. I know I would have trouble eating if I didn't have a lot of teeth. Jubilee wants to know if hobbits are really good at poetry. You know, in general, hobbits are not good at poetry. As far as I know, Bilbo was the only one who really went in for poetry. And as a matter of fact, it actually bored his friends and neighbors whenever he would start talking about his poetry. They thought he was boring. Okay, well, I didn't understand the one about the daisies. Okay, let me see if I can explain that to you. Let me go back. Uh-oh, here we go. See if it goes. Nope, didn't go back. And here we go. I've got it coming back now. All right, let's look at this one, Will, and see what is going on here. An eye in a blue face saw an eye in a green face. So the eye in the blue face is the sun. It's looking down and it sees an eye in a green face. And that would be down on like the grass, a flower sticking up. And inside the flower would be the center of the flower. And then the petals going around the flower. So that's the eye in the green face. And then so the sun says that eye is like to this eye, said the first play. The first eye is the sun. So the sun's the one doing the talking. He says that eye down there on the ground in the middle is surrounded by the flower petals. And I'm up here, the sun, and I'm surrounded by the blue sky. So he says, but in a low place, not in a high place. So meaning it's down on the ground, not up in the sky like the sun is. I hope that helps. Brennan would like to know if you could get salmonella poisoning from eating raw eggs. It depends on whether or not the egg is infected with salmonella. That's all I can say about that. Most eggs are not. We don't advise in our country against eating raw eggs, but I'll tell you here in Rome, they don't even refrigerate the eggs. They're just sitting on the counter. They're sitting outside in the markets. It's 90 degrees out there, and the eggs are sitting in egg cartons out there, and they're not in the sun because they have like an umbrella over their markets, but that's where I go to buy eggs. You go and you tell them how many eggs you want, and then they put them in a little box for you. So different countries, different things, but I don't usually eat raw eggs myself. Amy asked, would Gollum come out of the cave? You guys are so awesome with your questions. Amy, he would come out of that cave, but that's another story. So I'm going to leave it like that, and you be thinking about that, and then as you're reading The Fellowship of the Ring, you can get some information on that. Now I would like to know about the average size of the Gollum. Well, Gollum would probably be about Hobbit size, so I'd say under 4 feet tall. Declan says there is another Gollum because his grandmother's mentioned a few times. Well, that is true. And, you know, we don't really know what kind of a creature he is in this book. So therefore, we could logically assume that she is a type of Gollum. She's actually a hobbit. But that's a very, very good question, Declan. You're really a thinker. I like hearing things like that. Jubilee said, would Gollum eat the fish raw? I think so, because he does not have any way to cook things. And Willap has another question for us. Did Gollum live there before the goblins? Actually, that is mentioned in the book. He was there before the goblins. And there's a mention in the story about how he used to hang out with other creatures who lived under the mountains. I don't have a clue who those creatures are, so you can really let your imagination and your mind movie make a story about Gollum having friends living there. Let's go ahead and take a look at some more of these pictures here. I was going to go back but it won't let me go back again. Let's take a look at the pictures again. So we know now a little bit more about him, that he does eat things raw. This one here shows him actually holding a fish. And he has the big eyes. He lives in a dark cave under the ground. He wasn't fond of that sword at all. And during the riddle game, they asked the question, at the end of the riddle game, he gets asked a question about what is in my pocket. So you can imagine him looking at Bilbo while Bilbo's kind of going like, oh, what is this in my pocket? So what happens now is that Gollum goes back to his island to look for something. What he's looking for is his ring, because it's a magical ring and it makes one invisible. Gollum knows this. Bilbo hasn't got a clue. So Gollum comes back and he's angry. He wants to know what's in his pocket because he did not guess correctly in 3 tries. No matter how hard he tried, he could not guess what was in his pocket. So he assumes that Bilbo has stolen his ring. He thinks that's what's in his pocket. So Bilbo gets scared and takes off running up the tunnel that he came down. And while he was running, his hand was still in his pocket and the ring just slides on there and poof, he's invisible. So Gollum runs right past him. And Bilbo doesn't even know he's invisible. So Gollum is running along, running, and he's in front of Bilbo now. Bilbo's running along right behind him, and he's listening to Gollum. And Gollum's counting like the tunnel, so many to this side, so many to that side. That's how he's going to find his way out. And all the time he's talking to himself. Bilbo's silent because he's just running as much as he can to keep up with Gollum. Gollum starts talking about he can't know that this ring is a magical ring and that makes you invisible. And Bilbo goes like, invisible? Cool, I'm invisible now. So he follows him all the way out to the tunnel, all the way out. And then Bilbo can actually see the opening ahead. He can see the light. He knows that he can get out. And then Gollum stops and is blocking the way. Bilbo just can't brush by him because it makes him invisible. It doesn't make him not corporal. He still has a body. So he jumps over him and runs. And the last thing Bilbo hears from Gollum is, Baggins, thief, we hates it forever. Bilbo runs to the door. There we go. So he runs to the door, and just as he gets there, mind you, he thought he was invisible. Just as he gets there, the ring slips off his finger, and all of the goblins guarding the door, the only way that Bilbo knows to get out, they can see him now. This is our quote from the book. They saw him sooner than he saw them. Yes, they saw him. Whether it was an accident or a last trick of the ring before it took a new master, it was not on his finger. So what he does is he quickly slips the ring back on. He becomes invisible, but strong light will cast a very faint shadow of where you are. And so the goblins are running around and around and around trying to catch him. And then they discover, and they've also pushed the door tight so that it's just a little narrow bit of light. And Bilbo slides out and he squishes his way out, and he rips all the buttons off his coat, and they all go flying, but he's outside. And the goblins don't want to be outside in the light, so they don't chase him. So he runs and runs and runs and runs, and he is finally out of the goblin tunnels. Let's take a look at our questions here. Scrolling up. Okay, Will F would like to know, did Gollum live there before the goblins? Yes, we did answer that one. I'm sorry. Oh, Joshua would like, this is a very good question, and I've actually wondered this myself many times. Were there fish eggs for Gollum to eat? And I would rather imagine that the fish, would be laying eggs somewhere, and that Gollum would be somebody who would collect and eat those eggs as well. Fish eggs are different than bird eggs. They don't have the hard shell around them because they're protected in the water. That's how they keep the embryos inside the egg, the little baby fishes and developing fishes. That's how they keep moist, as they stay inside the water. Whereas a chicken or egg or a bird egg for that matter, has to be out of the water to develop the little baby inside. And so they don't want it to dry out. And that's why there's a hard shell. Okay. Jubilee would like to know, if hobbits are not good at poetry, why is Gollum so good at poetry? Actually, he's doing riddles. He's telling riddles. And that's one of the reasons why they figured out that Gollum was of Hobbit kind, because they had so much in common within the riddle telling, that back in their history, that it's an oral thing, that you're telling stories and telling puzzles. That's what a riddle is an oral puzzle. How long, Will would like to know about how long Gollum had been in the cave at this time. We would have found out in by reading the Fellowship of the Ring that he's been in there about 500 years. Kevin would like, this is a good question, Kevin. Kevin would like to know, why would he stay in the cave if he didn't have much food? Because he hated daylight. We learned that about him in the Fellowship of the Ring. He hated daylight and wanted to be someplace where it was dark. And we've got another question here from Opal about the goblins. Well, when the goblins came, he had his invisibility ring, and goblins were a source of food for him. So he would capture goblins and then eat them. Let's see what else we have. CJ would like to know if there was more than one way to get out of the caves and the tunnels. And actually, I believe that there were more than one entrance and exit to the cave, because he's going out this door, but they came in the other door. Remember, the goblins called it their front porch, that they found all those dwarves camping on their front porch, and that's why they took them to the Great Goblin. Alan would like to know if the goblins come out of their cave very often. Goblins would only be coming out if they're going to war, most likely, and then so that since they don't like being out in daylight, Alan, they would want to be traveling underground through their tunnel network as much as possible, and then they would come out when the sun was down. Caden was asking if there are only fish in the lake. That's the only thing I've ever heard mentioned, but Tolkien's kind of vague about what kind of things Gollum hung out with, and before the goblins came. So there could have been other things living in the water. Amy wants to know, will a hobbit eat a goblin? I can't imagine that a hobbit would want to do that. They must not be very tasty. And Jubilee said, are the goblins afraid of Gollum? Jubilee, you are absolutely correct. They are afraid. They don't know what Gollum is and that he's down there in that lake. They just know that there's something creepy, because the Great Goblin would send goblins down to get fish from the lake. And if they showed up there, Gollum would slip on his ring and capture them. And so goblins did not want to go to that lake to get fish for the Great Goblin, because there was a good chance they might not come back. So yes, they were afraid of the lake. They didn't know that Gollum was there. Josh would like to know about the size of the goblins that Gollum ate. They just mentioned that they were smaller goblins. I imagine goblins, like people, come in various sizes, but those were the ones that he liked, were the small goblins. And Will has a question about Gollum being similar to the trolls. In being a wicked person, yes. Yes, the trolls were wicked. Gollum was wicked. I don't know about any other similarities. Like, I don't think the trolls were made from the stone, according to the Ents. We learned that in the Two Towers. But Gollum is a real flesh and blood. If he steps out into the sunshine, all he's going to do is complain about it being too bright. Let's take a look at our journal information today, right now. I would like you to sketch the dagger that Bilbo uses as a sword. Now remember that it's just a dagger. It's not a fancy sword. So keep that in. And I do want you to answer, where did Gollum live? We've seen a lot of ideas about what Gollum looks like. He's somebody who really catches the fancy of artists, and lots of artists have read the description and come up with their own mind movie to create their pictures. And So I would like you to do that yourself. Think about what the description is and get your inspiration from the pictures we've looked at, and then sketch your own Gollum. And then I want you to answer, what did Bilbo have in his pocket? That can be a very simple answer. Okay, moving along here. Where did Gollum live? Gollum lived on a slimy island of rock in the middle of the lake. I found that on page 67 in my book. What did Bilbo have in his pocket? When Bilbo discovered he was alone in the darkness, he began to crawl around looking for a way out, till suddenly his hand met with what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. He put the ring in his pocket without thinking. There he found the ring he had picked up in his pocket. When he put his hand in, there he had found the ring he had picked up in the passage and forgotten about. Just making sure that I don't miss any good of your excellent questions before we go on. Let's talk about the next chapter. This is a very exciting chapter. It's actually kind of scary. I remember when I was a kid, it kind of scared me. But let's take a look here now. Hobbiton, Great East Road, Trolls, Rivendell. They got up in the mountains, went underground, and then they come out up here in this area. Now remember, they were trying for the Great East Road, so they ended up north of the Great East Road. So that's where, we don't know where everybody else is in the company. We know that Bilbo came out there. Let me put my notes up for this here. So Bilbo thinks about going back into the tunnels to see if he can find the dwarves, because he's all by himself. He thinks, wow, if they're still in there with the goblins, I've got this ring now. I should really go back in and help. So while he's thinking about that, he hears voices. And while he's wearing the ring, he slips up close to the company. And then that way he manages to reunite with them. At this time, Bilbo has learned that he's a lot stronger than he thought he was. He's lucky, yeah, but he's also very, very stealthy. And also, he's pretty courageous. He managed to get himself out of this mess alone. And then whenever he sneaks up on the dwarves, he hears them arguing. Gandalf's there, and Gandalf says, we need to go back in and get him. And the dwarves are saying, I don't think so. And then Bilbo takes off his ring and says, well, I'm here. And he steps out into the crowd, and they're going like, wow, how'd you get so close? We had a watch out. And then the person who was doing the watching, Balin, bows to him and accepts him, says, you are pretty crafty. I respect you now. He respected before. So anyway, what they do is they escape down the side of the mountain, and they come into this little glen, this little opening in the woods. And as they're standing there trying to decide what are they going to do next, because they've lost their pony, they've lost their food, they've lost their way, they don't really know exactly where they are. All of a sudden, this happens. But even the wild wargs, for so the evil wolves over the edge of the wild are named, cannot climb trees. For a time, they were safe. Luckily, it was warm and not windy. Trees are not very comfortable to sit in for long at any time. So anyway, all of a sudden, all these wargs, wild wolves, appear. They climb up into the trees just to get away from them. And it's like, oh my gosh, now what are we going to do? So they're all gathered around here. Look at all these eyes. I really like this picture because of that. You can see little Bilbo here, but there's eyes all the way back in the woods. They are surrounded by wolves. Well, Gandalf, what he does is he decides to drive them off. There's pine cones. These are fir trees. So he gets pine cone and he lights up a blue fire magically because he's a wizard. And he sets a pine cone on fire with this blue flame, and he throws it down and hits a wolf, and the wolf catches on fire and runs around. And so he starts lighting all these pine cones, and everybody's throwing them down at the wolves. And there's all of this flaming going on. Well, guess who shows up next? It's goblins. The goblins and the wargs had made an appointment to meet in this because they were going to go out and raid some villages. And so there they are, and they look around and they start laughing because, number one, they don't like dwarves, any dwarves. Number two, these dwarves are the ones that just escaped. And number three, they killed the great goblin. So they take all of the fire and they start building it up underneath the trees. They're going to burn them out of the trees. Well, it's a catastrophe. They're trapped. Gandalf doesn't know what else to do. Everybody is trapped in these trees. The trees are catching on fire. They're starting to feel the heat from the flames at the bottom of the tree. Catastrophe. Well, the opposite of a catastrophe is the eucatastrophe. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. Tolkien invented this word. A eucatastrophe is the opposite of a catastrophe, but it just happens. It's nothing you can plan. It's all of a sudden something good. Your bad thing turns into something good. And this is what happens. What is this uproar in the forest tonight? Said the Lord of the Eagles. So the Lord of the Eagles is up on his high perch looking out, and he sees all these flames and everything, and he can probably hear this big ruckus going on. He wants to know what's happening. So he and several of his fellows fly off to investigate. Well, they are going to irritate the goblins and the wargs. Eagles are not kind birds. Tolkien tells us that right away. They're not involved in this at all, but they don't like goblins and they don't like wargs. So they say, oh, well, we'll just take these guys. That ought to irritate them. And so it says right here now in this quote, other birds flew into the treetops and seized the dwarves who were scrambling up now as far as they ever dared to go. Take a look at this one here. There's little Bilbo. He's almost left behind because the eagles don't grab him. They grab the dwarf, and he grabs onto the dwarf's legs, and off they go. So this is the eucatastrophe that happens. Gandalf was about ready to just jump down and start, wailing on the goblins and the wargs and basically sacrifice himself. The eagles come so he doesn't have to. So now what happens? Well, the eagles, remember, aren't kind birds. They're not here to help anybody. They just came by and saw what was happening and says, well, we'll just take the prey away from the goblins because we don't like goblins. So they take them away to the area. So very soon, Bilbo was laid down, trembling with fear, on a wide shelf of rock on the mountain. There was a path down onto it, saved by flying, and no path down off it except by jumping over the precipice. There he found all the others sitting with their backs to the mountain wall. The Lord of the Eagles was also there, and he was speaking to Gandalf. And turns out Gandalf and this Lord of the Eagles know each other. Who knew? Gandalf gets around. But let's take a look at Tolkien's pictures here. Now, oh dear. There we go. In the background, you can see the Misty Mountains. They've come out on the east side of the Misty Mountains. Now, these are craggy mountains. And the picture over here, you can see little Bilbo laying down here. And this is what he meant. You couldn't climb down, and you couldn't climb down on this side either. So you're kind of trapped on this shelf unless you're flying. Let's take a quick moment here to look at our questions. They scroll by pretty fast. Okay. Caden wanted to know about the size of the fish. I think that we can leave that up to interpretation, that some fish are going to be bigger than others. I think that most of the fish were probably enough to provide him with a meal. Maybe not enough for 2 or 3 meals, but most things that live underground like that, animals are going to be a little bit smaller. Lee asked a question about how big was the back door. Good question, Lee. I know that it was big enough for the goblins to go in and out, and I know that it was big enough that they could. It wasn't so big though that they couldn't push it shut, because when the ring came off of Bilbo's finger at the door, they saw him, and one of the things they did was push the door almost shut. And that's the reason why Bilbo had to squeak himself out, and it ripped all the buttons off his coat. Well, I've asked a question about why did the Gollums not discover Gollum? Well, Gollum kind of stayed pretty close to the lake and the bottom tunnels of the mountains. And since he had his invisibility ring, they just couldn't see him. So if he could hear the goblins coming, or if he saw the goblins coming, he just put on his ring and vanished. Kevin has a question about why did the goblins get hurt by the sun? Kevin, I'm not so much sure that they would be hurt or like getting a sunburn or something. I think that they just did not like to be outside in the sun. And that's mentioned several times in the Fellowship of the Ring about how much goblins hated being outside. I know that they preferred to be underground. Opal has a question about, oh dear, let me hang on, Opal. Your question bounced up because another one came. There it is. Where was the slimy island? The slimy island was close enough to the edge of the lake so that he, meaning Gollum, could paddle himself back and forth using his hands and feet. So it wouldn't have been a super, super long way. Brendan has a question about why can't the wolves smell Bilbo? I think when they're in the trees that they could smell the dwarves and Bilbo quite well. Jubilee wants to know if the trees were pines. He refers to them as fir trees. A fir tree is a type of a conifer. He refers to the cones that Gandalf lights on fire as pine cones. So to me, that says that they are pine trees. But now I'm from Alaska. We have spruce trees, and nobody calls them spruce cones. They call them pine cones, but they're spruce cones. So I think that it might be just what people call them, because pine cones are just kind of like what we call things, like we call a car instead of calling a Ford or a Chevy or something like that. We don't say, oh, this is a spruce cone, this is a fir cone, this is a cedar cone. We just call it a pine cone. How long have the eagles been on the mountains? I think that they are ageless. They've probably been there for a long, long time, Jubilee. Charles wanted to know if the wargs are normal wolves or magic wolves. Well, since we're in the wild, they might be magical. I would not be surprised if they didn't have magical powers. CJ wants to know if there are girl dwarves. Well, yes, there are. And that is another thing that does not come into The Hobbit, because like I said yesterday, we don't have any female characters. They do mention female elves and female hobbits, and I think they might mention women as well whenever we get further into the book, but we don't really have any characters who are female dwarves. Would an eagle eat a goblin? I don't know, because we'll have to ask that question. I don't know, because they're probably pretty discerning and don't want to eat something that's going to be not tasted like that. Alan is wondering if the Lord of the Eagles would be bigger than the other eagles. Alan, I think that you are correct in that. I think that it's mentioned in there that he is a bit larger than the others. Jubilee wants to know if the eagles know about Gollum. Another Tolkien scholar question here. I do not know if they knew about him, because he went into the ground under the ground a long time ago. They may have known about him, but they don't mention it. Joshua has a question about, on the right drawings, are those rocks or goblins? I don't know which picture you're referring to, but I think all of the pictures that I showed you, Joshua, had to do with just Bilbo and Gollum. Mira wanted to know how big the eagles are. These are giant eagles. They are big enough to carry a human, because Gandalf rides on one quite easily. And Samuel has a question about, did the wargs know Gandalf? You know, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they hadn't heard of him, or at least met him, because he gets around. You know, he knew the Lord of the Eagles. Gandalf knows a lot of people, apparently. Let's take a look at our journal drawings and questions here. I want you to sketch the warg attack. Now, here's where you have to decide what kind of trees you're going to put on there. Are you going to have Gandalf throwing down fire? Are you going to just have the wolves standing around underneath? Are you going to have them nipping at the dwarves as they're trying to jump up in the trees? You've got a lot of things to think about there in that drawing. Your first question is, what did Gandalf do while the company was trapped? Your second one is sketching the eagle saving the company. Remember, that's the eucatastrophe. So I could have said, sketch the eucatastrophe. And I bet you guys would have understood exactly what I was saying. Our next question is, where did the eagles take the company? Let's take a look at some of these here. Okay. What did Gandalf do while the company was trapped? Gandalf gathered the huge pine cones from the branches of the tree. Then he set one alight with a bright blue fire and threw it whizzing down among the circle of wolves. So see, he does call them pine cones, although they mentioned them as fir trees in the book as well. Okay, let's go ahead and do our next question. And then I'm going to talk some more about some questions. I have a clarification here on one of the questions. Where did the eagles take the company? Well, Gandalf asked if they would take them further on our journey because they wanted to get as far as close to the mountain as they could. The eagle said no, because there are men there, and men will shoot at us with their arrows because they think we're coming to steal their sheep and cows and carry them off and eat them. And he said, and we would, but we're not going there, but we'll take you elsewhere. And so they took the company. The flight ended only just in time for him, meaning Bilbo, just before his arms gave way. He loosed Dory's ankle with a gasp and fell on the rough platform of an eagle's eyrie. Eyrie is spelled a number of ways. This is the way that Tolkien spelled it, so it's the way that I use it in this book. But an eyrie is an eagle nest. And being from Alaska, that's another thing, is we do have an awful lot of eagles. And eagles mostly in Alaska nest on the tops of trees. And they're real easy to spot because they're all their sticks sticking out everywhere. And so imagine being a hobbit and being dropped into a bunch of sticks. That would have been uncomfortable. Let's go back to the picture of the eucatastrophe here. Goblins in the picture. Let's see if we can go back to this one here. Joshua asked a question about them being on the rocks, if those were goblins. Well, I can see here we have dwarves in the trees here on Mr. Naismith's drawing. And I'm looking around on the rocks. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there weren't goblins within the pictures here, and even wargs, because most artists are very detailed in what they're thinking about. Amy has a question here. Did the wargs go into battle? I'm not sure which battle you're talking about, Amy, but further into our book, we will talk about the wargs. Whenever we get towards the end of our book, we'll talk about wargs some more. Will F would like to know, does Gandalf exactly know about Gollum? Well, that's kind of vague right now, because when Bilbo comes out, he doesn't talk about the ring at all. So we're a little unsure what Gandalf knows about Gollum at this time in our story. He could have heard about him because, like I said, Gandalf obviously gets around and knows a lot of people. And by people, I'm referring to the birds as well as elves and so on. Gandalf knows a lot. So he may have known about Gollum. Declan has a question here about how did the goblins and wargs communicate? I know that the wargs have a language because Gandalf actually understood their language. And they were talking about all the mean things that they were going to do to the dwarves whenever they got them. And they were going to do all sorts of really mean things. So I would not be able to tell you what the language is like, but I imagine it sounded like a lot of growling and snarling. So if Gandalf could understand it, the goblins could probably understand it. So they must have had some way to communicate because they arranged this time. And the age of the eagles, Jaylee, I don't know how old those are. If you can, tomorrow I'll see if I can, well, tonight I'll see if I can find out any additional information on the age of the eagles, but I have not received any information on that in any of the stuff. I can make some guesses from the Silmarillion, and we can talk about that. But we are out of time today, class, and I am really, really excited once again with the questions. You guys asked such good questions. I'm really looking forward to the next 2 chapters for tomorrow. So do work in your journals and do get all ready to read the next 2 chapters with me tomorrow. Looking forward to seeing you.
Okay, very good. Thanks, everybody. That was great fun here today. Really enjoyed your questions, and we look forward to tomorrow. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Good night.